Anne saw nothing, thought nothing of the brilliancy of the room. Her happiness was from within. Her eyes were bright and her cheeks glowed, but she knew nothing about it. She was thinking only of the last half hour, and as they passed to their seats her mind took a hasty range over it. Her choice of subjects, his expressions, and still more his manner and look had been such as she could see in only one light. His opinion of Louisa Musgrove's inferiority, an opinion which he had seemed solicitous to give, his wonder at Captain Benwick, his feelings as to a first strong attachment, sentences begun which he could not finish, his half-averted eyes and more than half-expressive glance, all declared that he had a heart returning to her at least, that anger, resentment, avoidance were no more, and that they were succeeded not merely by friendship and regard, but by the tenderness of the past, yes, some share of the tenderness of the past. She could not contemplate the change as implying less. He must love her. These were thoughts with their attendant visions, which occupied and flurried her too much to leave her any power of observation, and she passed along the room without having a glimpse of him, without even trying to discern him. When their places were determined on, and they were all properly arranged, she looked round to see if he should happen to be in the same part of the room, but he was not. Her eye could not reach him, and the concert being just opening, she must consent for a time to be happy in an humbler way. The party was divided and disposed of on two contiguous benches. Anne was among those on the foremost, and Mr. Elliot had manoeuvred so well, with the assistance of his friend Colonel Wallis, as to have a seat by her. Miss Elliot, surrounded by her cousins, and the principal object of Colonel Wallis's gallantry, was quite contented. Anne's mind was in a most favourable state for the entertainment of the evening. It was just occupation enough. She had feelings for the tender spirits for the gay, attention for the scientific, and patience for the wearisome, and had never liked a concert better, at least during the first act. Towards the close of it, in the interval succeeding an Italian song, she explained the words of the song to Mr. Elliot. They had a concert bill between them. "This," said he, "is nearly the sense, or rather the meaning of the words, for certainly the sense of an Italian love song must not be talked of, but it is as nearly the meaning as I can give, for I do not pretend to understand the language. I am a very poor Italian scholar." Yes, I see you are. I see you know nothing of the matter. You have only knowledge enough of the language to translate at sight these inverted, transposed, curtailed Italian lines into clear, comprehensible, elegant English. You need not say anything more of your ignorance. Here is complete proof. I will not oppose such kind politeness, but I should be sorry to be examined by a real proficient. "I have not had the pleasure of visiting in Camden Place so long," replied he, "without knowing something of Miss Anne Elliot, and I do regard her as one who is too modest for the world in general to be aware of half her accomplishments, and too highly accomplished for modesty to be natural in any other woman." For shame, this is too much flattery. I forget what we are to have next," turning to the bill. "Perhaps," said Mr. Elliot, speaking low, "I have had a longer acquaintance with your character than you are aware of." "Indeed, how so?" "You can have been acquainted with it only since I came to Bath, excepting, as you might hear me previously spoken of, in my own family. I knew you by report long before you came to Bath. I had heard you described by those who knew you intimately. I have been acquainted with you by character many years. Your person, your disposition, accomplishments, manner, they are all described. They were all present to me." Mr. Elliot was not disappointed in the interest he hoped to raise. No one can withstand the charm of such a mystery. To have been described long ago to a recent acquaintance by the nameless people is irresistible, and Anne was all curiosity. She wondered and questioned him eagerly, but in vain. He delighted in being asked, but he would not tell. No, some time or other perhaps, but not now. He would mention no names now, but such, he could assure her, had been the fact. He had many years ago received such a description of Miss Anne Elliot as had inspired him with the highest idea of her merit, and excited the warmest curiosity to know her. Anne could think of no one so likely to have spoken with partiality of her many years ago as the Mr. Wentworth of Monkford, Captain Wentworth's brother. He might have been in Mr. Elliot's company, but she had not courage to ask the question. "The name of Anne Elliot," said he, "has long had an interesting sound to me. Very long has it possessed a charm over my fancy. and if I died, I would breathe my wishes that the name might never change. Such she believed were his words, but scarcely had she received their sound than her attention was caught by other sounds immediately behind her, which rendered everything else trivial. Her father and Lady Dalrymple were speaking. "A well-looking man," said Sir Walter, "a very well-looking man. A very fine young man, indeed," said Lady Dalrymple, "more than one often sees in Bath. Irish, I dare say." "No, I just know his name, a bowing acquaintance. Wentworth, Captain Wentworth of the Navy. His sister married my tenant in Somersetshire, the Croft, who rents Kellynch." Before Sir Walter had reached this point, Anne's eyes had caught the right direction and distinguished Captain Wentworth standing among a cluster of men at a little distance. As her eyes fell on him, his seemed to be withdrawn from her. It had that appearance. It seemed as if she had been one moment too late, and as long as she dared observe, he did not look again. But the performance was recommencing, and she was forced to seem to restore her attention to the orchestra and look straight forward. When she could give another glance, he had moved away. He could not have come nearer to her if he would. She was so surrounded and shut in, but she would rather have caught his eye. Mr. Elliot's speech too distressed her. She had no longer any inclination to talk to him. She wished him not so near her. The first act was over. Now she hoped for some beneficial change, and after a period of nothing saying amongst the party, some of them did decide on going in quest of tea. Anne was one of the few who did not choose to move. She remained in her seat, and so did Lady Russell. But she had the pleasure of getting rid of Mr. Elliot, and she did not mean, whatever she might feel on Lady Russell's account, to shrink from conversation with Captain Wentworth if he gave her the opportunity. She was persuaded by Lady Russell's countenance that she had seen him. He did not come, however. Anne sometimes fancied she discerned him at a distance, but he never came. The anxious interval wore away unproductively. The others returned. The room filled again. Benches were reclaimed and repossessed. And another hour of pleasure or of penance was to be sat out. Another hour of music was to give delight, or the gapes as real or affected taste, for it prevailed. To Anne it chiefly wore the prospect of an hour of agitation. She could not quit that room in peace without seeing Captain Wentworth once more, without the interchange of one friendly look. In resettling themselves, there were now many changes, the result of which was favourable for her. Colonel Willis declined sitting down again, and Mr. Elliot was invited by Elizabeth and Miss Carteret in a manner not to be refused to sit between them. And by some other removals and a little scheming of her own, Anne was enabled to place herself much nearer the end of the bench than she had been before, much more within the reach of a passer-by. She could not do so without comparing herself with Miss Larolles, the inimitable Miss Larolles, but still she did it, and not with much happier effect, though by what seemed prosperity in the shape of an early abdication in her next neighbours, she found herself at the very end of the bench before the concert closed. Such was her situation, with a vacant space at hand, when Captain Wentworth was again in sight. She saw him not far off. He saw her too. Yet he looked grave and seemed irresolute, and only by very slow degrees came at last near enough to speak to her. She felt that something must be the matter. The change was indubitable. The difference between his present air and what it had been in the octagon room was strikingly great. Why was it? She thought of her father, of Lady Russell. Could there have been any unpleasant glances? He began by speaking of the concert gravely, more like the Captain Wentworth of Uppercross, owned himself disappointed and expected better singing, and in short must confess that he should not be sorry when it was over. Anne replied and spoke in defence of the performance so well, and yet in allowance for his feelings so pleasantly, that his countenance improved, and he replied again with almost a smile. They talked for a few minutes more. The improvement held. He even looked down towards the bench as if he saw a place on it well worth occupying, when at that moment a touch on her shoulder obliged Anne to turn around. It came from Mr. Elliot. He begged her pardon, but she must be applied to explain Italian again. Miss Carteret was very anxious to have a general idea of what was next to be sung, and could not refuse, but never had the sacrifice to politeness with a more suffering spirit. Never had she sacrificed to politeness with a more suffering spirit. A few minutes, though as few as possible, were inevitably consumed, and when her own mistress again, when able to turn and look as she had done before, she found herself accosted by Captain Wentworth in a reserved yet a hurried sort of farewell. He must wish her good night. He was going. He should get home as fast as he could. Is not this song worth staying for? Said Anne, suddenly struck by an idea which made her yet more anxious to be encouraging. No, he replied impressively, there is nothing worth my staying for, and he was gone directly. Jealousy of Mr. Elliot. It was the only intelligible motive. Captain Wentworth jealous of her affection. Could she have believed it a week ago, 3 hours ago? For a moment the gratification was exquisite, but alas, there were very different thoughts to succeed. How was such jealousy to be quieted? How was the truth to reach him? How, in all the peculiar disadvantages of their respective situations, would he ever learn her real sentiments? It was misery to think of Mr. Elliot's attentions. Their evil was incalculable. Chapter 21. Anne recollected with pleasure the next morning her promise of going to Mrs. Smith, meaning that it should engage her from home at the time when Mr. Elliot would be most likely to call, for to avoid Mr. Elliot was almost a first object. She felt a great deal of goodwill towards him. In spite of the mischief of his attentions, she owed him gratitude and regard, perhaps compassion. She could not help thinking much of the extraordinary circumstances attending their acquaintance, of the right which he seemed to have to interest her by everything in situation, by his own sentiments, by his early prepossession. It was altogether very extraordinary, flattering but painful. There was much to regret. How she might have felt had there been no Captain Wentworth in the case was not worth inquiring, for there was a Captain Wentworth, and be the conclusion of the present suspense good or bad, her affection would be his forever. The union, she believed, could not divide her more from other men than their final separation. Pretty musings of high-wrought love and eternal constancy could never have passed along the streets of Bath than Anne was sporting with from Camden Place to Westgate Buildings. It was almost to spread purification and perfume all the way. She was sure of a pleasant reception, and her friend seemed this morning particularly obliged to her for coming, seemed hardly to have expected her, though it had been an appointment. An account of the concert was immediately claimed, and Anne's recollections of the concert were quite happy enough to animate her features and make her rejoice to talk of it. All that she could tell she told most gladly, but the all was little for one who had been there, and unsatisfactory for such an inquirer as Mrs. Smith, who had already heard, through the shortcut of a laundress and a waiter, rather more of the general success and produce of the evening than Anne could relate, and who now asked in vain for several particulars of the company. Everybody of any consequence or notoriety in Bath was well known by name to Mrs. Smith. The little Durants were there, I conclude, said she, with their mouths open to catch the music, like unfledged sparrows ready to be fed. They never miss a concert. Yes, I did not see them myself, but I heard Mr. Elliot say they were in the room. The Ibbotsons, were they there, and the two new beauties, with a tall Irish officer who was talked of for one of them? I do not know. I do not think they were. Old Lady Mary McLean, I need not ask after her. She never misses, I know, and you must have seen her. She must have been in your circle, in your own circle, for as you went with Lady Dalrymple, you were in the seats of grandeur, round the orchestra, of course. No, that was what I dreaded. It would have been very unpleasant to me in every respect, but happily Lady Dalrymple always chooses to be farther off, and we were exceedingly well placed, that is, for hearing. I must not say for seeing, because I appear to have seen very little. Oh, and you saw enough for your own amusement, I can understand. There is a sort of domestic enjoyment to be known even in a crowd, and this you had. You were a large party in yourselves, and you wanted nothing beyond. But I ought to have looked about me more, said Anne, conscious while she spoke that there had in fact been no want of looking about, that the object only had been deficient. Oh, no, you were better employed. You need not tell me that you had a pleasant evening. I see it in your eye. I perfectly see how the hours passed, that you had always something agreeable to listen to in the intervals of the concert. It was conversation. Anne half smiled and said, Do you see that in my eye? Yes, I do. Your countenance perfectly informs me that you were in company last night with a person whom you think the most agreeable in the world, the person who interests you at this present time more than all the rest of the world put together. A blush overspread Anne's cheeks. She could say nothing. And such being the case, continued Mrs. Smith after a short pause, I hope you believe that I do know how to value your kindness in coming to me this morning. It is really very good of you to come and sit with me, when you must have so many pleasant demands upon your time. Anne heard nothing of this. She was still in the astonishment and confusion excited by her friend's penetration, unable to imagine how any report of Captain Wentworth could have reached her. After another short silence, "Pray," said Mrs. Smith, "is Mr. Elliot aware of your acquaintance with me? Does he know that I am in Bath?" "Mr. Elliot?" repeated Anne, looking up surprised. A moment's reflection showed her the mistake she had been under. She caught it instantaneously, and recovering courage with the feeling of safety, soon added, more composedly, "Are you acquainted with Mr. Elliot?" "I have been a good deal acquainted with him," replied Mrs. Smith gravely, "but it seems worn out now. It is a great while since we met." "I was not at all aware of this. You never mentioned it before. Had I known it, I would have had the pleasure of talking to him about you." "To confess the truth," said Mrs. Smith, assuming her usual air of cheerfulness, "that is exactly the pleasure I want you to have. I want you to talk about me to Mr. Elliot. I want your interest with him. He can be of essential service to me, and if you would have the goodness, my dear Miss Elliot, to make it an object to yourself, of course it is done." "I should be extremely happy. I hope you cannot doubt my willingness to be of even the slightest use to you," replied Anne. "But I suspect that you are considering me as having a higher claim on Mr. Elliot, a greater right to influence him, than is really the case. I'm sure you have, somehow or other, imbibed such a notion. You must consider me only as Mr. Elliot's relation. If in that light, if there is anything which you suppose his cousin might fairly ask of him, I beg you would not hesitate to employ me." Mrs. Smith gave her a penetrating glance, and then smiling, said, "I have been a little premature, I perceive. I beg your pardon. I ought to have waited for official information. But now, my dear Miss Elliot, as an old friend, do give me a hint as to when I may speak." "Next week? To be sure, by next week I may be allowed to think it all settled, and build my own selfish schemes on Mr. Elliot's good fortune." "No," replied Anne, "nor next week, nor next, nor next. I assure you that nothing of the sort you're thinking of will be settled any week. I'm not going to marry Mr. Elliot. I should like to know why you imagine I am." Mrs. Smith looked at her again, looked earnestly, smiled, shook her head, and exclaimed, "Now, how I do wish I understood you! How I do wish I knew what you were at! I have a great idea what you do not design to be that you do not design to be cruel when the right moment comes. Till it does come, you know, we women never mean to have anybody. It is a thing, of course, among us that every man is refused till he offers. But why should you be cruel? Let me plead for my present friend. I cannot call him, but for my former friend. Where can you look for a more suitable match? Where could you expect a more gentlemanlike, agreeable man? Let me recommend Mr. Elliot. I'm sure you hear nothing but good of him from Colonel Wallis, and who can know him better than Colonel Wallis?" "My dear Mrs. Smith, Mr. Elliot's wife has not been dead much above half a year. He ought not to be supposed to be paying his addresses to any one." "Oh, if these are your only objections," cried Mrs. Smith archly, "Mr. Elliot is safe, and I shall give myself no more trouble about him. Do not forget me when you are married, that's all. Let him know me to be a friend of yours, and then he will think little of the trouble required, which it is very natural for him now, with so many affairs and engagements of his own to avoid and get rid of as he can. Very natural, perhaps. 99 out of 100 would do the same. Of course, he cannot be aware of the importance to me. Well, my dear Miss Elliot, I hope and trust you will be very happy. Mr. Elliot has sense to understand the value of such a woman. Your peace will not be shipwrecked as mine has been. You are safe in all worldly matters, and safe in his character. He will not be led astray. He will not be misled by others to his ruin." "No," said Anne, "I cannot readily believe all that of my cousin. He seems to have a calm, decided temper, not at all open to dangerous impressions. I consider him with great respect. I have no reason for anything that has fallen within my observation to do otherwise. But I have not known him long, and he is not a man, I think, to be known intimately soon. Will not this matter of speaking of him, Mrs. Smith, convince you that he is nothing to me? Surely this must be calm enough, and upon my word he is nothing to me. Should he ever propose to me, which I have very little reason to imagine he has any thought of doing, I shall not accept him. I assure you I shall not. I assure you Mr. Elliot had not the share which you have been supposing in whatever pleasure the concert of last night might afford. Not Mr. Elliot. It is not Mr. Elliot that—" She stopped, regretting with a deep blush that she had implied so much. But less would hardly have been sufficient. Mrs. Smith would hardly have believed so soon in Mr. Elliot's failure, but from the perception of there being a somebody else. As it was, she instantly submitted, and with all the semblance of seeing nothing beyond, and Anne, eager to escape farther notice, was impatient to know why Mrs. Smith should have fancied she was to marry Mr. Elliot, where she could have received the idea, or from whom she could have heard it